Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, the 8th of December, 2020. This is the last presentation of the fall semester, and I'm delighted to see so many familiar faces in the audience today. Let me say a little bit about the colloquium before introducing our speaker for today. This is the 20th year for the colloquium, which honors the memory of the late Malcolm Renfrew, who was an award-winning chemist, chemistry teacher, trombone player, and artist who really epitomized the spirit of the arts and humanities at the University of Idaho. Each week, we bring a different speaker from the faculty, sometimes visiting scholars, graduate students, postdocs, and my co-coordinator, Dan Buckfitch, has been with the program since the beginning in the fall of 2001. I've been co-coordinating since 2012. So it's a great pleasure to see the range of teaching, research, creative activity, and outreach activities by our faculty from across the university. I would also like to make a pitch for proposals for spring of 2021. I have about 12 slots filled and 4 or 5 still to go. So if you are interested or know somebody who might be interested, I would invite them to just shoot an email to kbird, K-B-I-R-D, at UIdaho by this Friday, the 11th, and we'll try to work you into the program. Today, to cap the fall semester program, our topic is a topic dear to my heart, newspapers on the Western frontier. And our presenter is Cieslik-Miskimen from the School of Journalism and Mass Media. Caitlin came to the University of Idaho in fall of 2019. And in addition to media history, she teaches courses in public relations. She received her MA and PhD in journalism and mass communication from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And in addition, she has worked as a multimedia content producer and a public relations account executive. She's currently working on a book proposal about small city newspapers, which have not had the attention that the metro newspapers in this country have. So please welcome Professor Cieslik-Miskimen.
Thank you so much, Kenton. I'm very excited to be here. I also know this is the last week of this semester, so I'll keep my comments and my talk to about 40 to 45 minutes. At the end, I'll open it up for questions. You do have my email on this slide, so if any questions pop up that you're not able to ask me, or if you have any ideas, or if you know of any treasure trove of old newspapers stashed somewhere in the state of Idaho, please feel free to send me an email. So I'm going to start my story today in the spring of 1864. In June 1864, the city of Boise, Idaho had been rapidly growing. There were now more than 1,000 people in the fledgling community, and a number of prominent Boise citizens had decided that it was high time for the city of Boise to have a newspaper. A prominent Boisean in June 1864 got word that there were 3 men who were transporting a newspaper plant from Oregon to Bannock City, which would then become known as Idaho City, about 45 miles north of Boise. He mounted a fast horse and sped to intercept them. At the time, Idaho City was the much bigger city. There were about 7,000 people who were living there, but Boise was the future. Also, Idaho City already had a newspaper at this point in time. The gentleman offered the trio $1,500 and the use of a building for 1 year if they promised to come to Boise instead of Idaho City, and they agreed. When they got there, though, they found the building that was promised was a log cabin. It had a dirt floor, no door, and no glass in the windows, but it would do. And in July 1864, the first issue of the Idaho Tri-Weekly Statesman appeared. The first issue said, quote, "We shall undertake to conduct the Statesman as shall best advance the interests of this community and this territory, knowing that in doing so we shall best secure our own." The key targets of the founder of this newspaper were to attract railroads, to attract an exposition fair to Boise, boost Boise's prospects as the state capital, and articulate the need for better schools. I start with this anecdote because this anecdote demonstrates how important newspapers were to the many small settlements and communities in the Western United States, and not just the Western United States, but really the United States as a whole. As the United States expanded, both geographically and in terms of population, the US government adopted a policy of communications that would facilitate the cheap and easy exchange of information throughout the United States. This in turn helped encourage the growth of print culture in the country and created new roles for newspapers. We often tend to think of newspapers through one of two lenses. A lot of communication scholars focus on the information function of newspapers, or that democracy building function, that exchange of news, that circulation of information as it relates to a strong and healthy democracy, or as it relates to the functionings of the republic. But there's another angle to these newspapers, and that's this cultural role that newspapers play. And for me, as a researcher, I'm more interested in the cultural function of newspapers. So what can we tell about what it meant to live in a specific place at a specific point in time, looking at the content of newspapers, looking at the stories that are reported, the photos and the images appear, the narrative styles that are used. On the frontier, newspapers served three purposes. They helped link a settlement to Washington, D.C., and they provide a platform for political education. They also played an important boosting function that advertised a town to potential settlers and investors. There's a tendency often to consider Western newspapers clones of their East Coast counterparts. However, while Western publishers certainly used Eastern newspapers as their models, they were different in several key respects. Western publishers, whether they were first in the Midwest and then in the Great Plains and then west of the Rockies, operated in greater isolation and farther from the material, labor, and major news sources that publishers in other parts of the continent had access to. Hundreds of miles separated these settlements from one another. If we think about the Western commercial hub of San Francisco, there were hundreds, if not thousands of miles separating that commercial hub from the mining camps of Idaho, the agricultural settlements of Eastern Washington, or even the agricultural developments of Southern California. Further, the boomtown development that was so common in the West made the business of producing a newspaper much more precarious. Newspapers were especially vulnerable to audiences that disappeared as ore veins played out or as better prospects were developed elsewhere. So if we are to look at the history of Western newspapers, we see a lot of short-lived publications. We see a lot of publishers who went around from settlement to settlement, trying to follow either mining developments, what they saw as better prospects, or again, potentially greener pastures. Just to give ourselves kind of a visual perspective, the time period that I'm talking about can range very widely. People start moving westward away from the East Coast in the United States in the 1750s, 1760s, but most of my story is really concentrated in the mid-19th century. Print culture underwent a transformation in the 19th century due in part to improvements in printing technology, the reduction in the cost of materials such as paper, and policies that favored the circulation of information, best exemplified by the post office and the rapid expansion of the post office throughout the United States. As people moved west, they set up newspapers, and the number of newspapers dramatically increases over the course of the 1800s. There were only 17 newspapers published in then the American colonies in 1759. By 1819, that had gone up to 518 newspapers. By 1833, there were 1,300 newspapers published in the United States, a mix of daily publications and weekly publications. And by 1850, there were 2,526 newspapers that had a total annual circulation of 500 million copies for a population of a little under 23.2 million people. Not only were more papers being published as the century wore on, but more people were reading newspapers. As a quick aside, this consumption of news and the sheer number of newspapers is one of the many things that makes the American media environment distinct from the media environments in other places in the world. No other place at this point in time had such an affinity for newspapers and had such a high reading population. In many instances, newspapers replaced letters as the primary source of information. Again, startup costs at this point in time were modest, which meant there was a less financial risk for a printer to start publishing a newspaper. Especially for people living in the hinterland or people living on the fringes, newspapers became a valuable tool for people to feel greater connection, not just back to the state capital, a territorial capital, or to the national capital, but to feel a sense of connection and a sense of community with their fellow Americans. Newspapers also played a symbolic role. For many communities, especially these new settlements, they were a sign that the community had arrived. To have a newspaper was to have something worth reporting about. Newspapers then also played an important role in encouraging westward settlement throughout the United States. So who were these frontier publishers? Printers, just as businessmen and farmers, were looking for new opportunities in the western United States, and they shifted from place to place if new prospects popped up that seemed better than their current situation. They traveled their countryside with their printing press in a wagon or strapped to the back of a mule, and they brought printing presses secondhand and set up shop in those places where they believed there was the most future opportunity. There was no uniform background to these frontier publishers. Some were printers or publishers by training, some were journalists or writers, others were lawyers, doctors, and educators. The experience of Adam Albach, a publisher of the Idaho Sun in Murray, Idaho, was typical. Adam was born in Belleville, Illinois, and he completed an apprenticeship at the St. Louis Republican at the age of 16. He saved up money to move west to Montana when he had heard about the gold prospects in the state. However, the Civil War broke out, so he joined fighting in the Civil War and afterward moved to Utah to publish the Verdette in Salt Lake City. He left Salt Lake City after 2 years to start another newspaper in Corinne, Utah. And in the next 10 years, he moved to San Francisco, San Jose, Philadelphia, and New York before returning to Montana and northern Idaho in 1884, where he started the Idaho Sun. He had been lured west again by the promise of gold and the potential of the region, especially as the Northern Pacific Railroad was eyeing an expansion in that part of the country. He arrived with his entire printing outfit stripped to the backs of 45 mules and set up in a log cabin. The position of editor was slowly becoming one of influence in the mid-19th century, but many editors and writers at the time were poorly trained. The printing press required little skill to operate, and there were no requirements to be a writer. There were no standards of objectivity. There were no standards of professionalism that an editor or a publisher needed to embody. Really, a printed paper at this point in time was, again, a signal. It was an effort to connect a community to the greater United States, but it was also an effort to lure more people to that particular locality. Often the attitude and influence of a paper depended to a large extent upon the editor himself. And just as an aside, while there were some female newspaper publishers at this point in time, by and large, the bulk of the publishers that we're talking about at this, during this time period are male. There were some instances where a publisher provided the financial backing as well as an input on editorial direction and slant and then hired others to do the work. But for the most part, these newspapers were very small operations. Often, the Western editor had some political affiliation. The typical publisher had some affiliation, even if the paper professed editorial independence. The myth of the frontier publisher, as the historian Barbara Cloud noted, was less about driving gun-toting bullies out of town than getting their political friends into office. We can see an example of this looking at the first issue of the Idaho News published in Blackfoot, Idaho. The first issue began with the disclaimer of, quote, politically, we shall be true to our training and shall, as occasion demands, advocate with the best strokes of our pen the principles of the grand old Democratic Party. These editors, though, for all of their political inclinations, had an overall purpose of business enterprise, and their job in producing these newspapers was often a struggle. They were not only responsible for collecting the news items and laying the news pages out and publishing them on a regular basis, but they also were responsible for selling subscriptions, courting advertisers, boosting the prospects of their village or town, and again, they were typically involved in some extent with politics. The struggle to collect subscription fees particularly was a time-consuming task, which could dictate the longevity of a publication. Paying in advance, which would have greatly eased this problem, was really not an option in the mid-1800s. Publishers, as a result, often adopted a barter policy, where they would accept things like corn and cattle, beeswax, and other goods in exchange for a subscription. Many publishers throughout the western United States were happy to accept gold dust as a form of payment for their newspapers. Despite this flexibility, though, many historical records of country printers detail the amount of effort they went to track down delinquent subscribers and how much of their time was spent trying to close some of these accounts. William Byers, the publisher of the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, would publish a list of overdue subscribers in his newspaper and offer to sell that list to an individual who would promise to collect the past due accounts. He divided his list of past due accounts by employment category, with showmen and showman professionals being the largest category of delinquent subscribers. Further, these newspapers were often published in less than ideal conditions. I have on this slide an example of a log cabin type setup. This is the original log cabin that housed the Superior Chronicle in Superior, Wisconsin, as it appeared in 1855. And this structure was very typical of these settlement publishing setups. These newspapers were often published in less than ideal conditions, in log cabins that had leaky roofs. Sometimes these setups would appear outside under trees where no structure was available. These newspaper offices were frequently damaged and many of them burned down. Further, these early publishers relied heavily on the mail, which could be severely delayed. If you were to look back at old examples of newspapers, you will see many apologies for the lack of news content due to delays in receiving the mail. To put this in perspective, in the 1850s, Salt Lake City typically got mail service once per month, if at all. A delivery in fall 1854 of 13 sacks of mail to the Deseret News contained some mail that was more than 2 years old. The Idaho Tri-Weekly Statesman began as a tri-weekly in order to take advantage of the tri-weekly mail service that was coming to Boise. The suspense in publishing, the historian Barbara Cloud noted, came from the tension created when the mail was delayed or a shipment of paper came in late, not necessarily the tension between competing newspapers, like we might have seen in major cities of the East Coast. A quote about the early days of the Tri-Weekly Statesman sums up this publishing environment quite well. In getting out the paper on time, we worked nearly all night, and frequently the Boise Basin stage would pull out ahead of us, and we would have to send someone to overtake it on a horse with the mail packages meant for different mining camps throughout the state. So what was in the pages of these newspapers? Well, at first, these newspapers carried little local news. They would only carry the local news that would promote a community or provide practical information for individuals who might be considered relocating to that settlement. These newspapers were typically shorter. They were 4 to 8 pages, published weekly. They were packed with text, and there was little, if any, illustrations. There was no formula for determining when and where a paper would start. It was typically a mix of things such as population, stability of readership, and anticipated growth. If we think back to Boise in 1864, there was a population there of about 1,000, and that encouraged the founding of the Tri-Weekly Statesman. But if we are to head north to Spokane, Washington, Francis Cook started a newspaper there with a population of only 100, anticipating the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad. These newspapers were filled with booster content that was designed to sell a community. The publishers wanted to promote a town or city and attract new residents and investment, such as a new business, internal infrastructure improvements, things like canals and railroads. According to the historian Daniel Borston, Boosterism, both in terms of newspaper content and business activity, assumed economic interests of local businesses and outside investors were identical to those of the community. This ethos was essentially idealistic, as it offered a vision that fused economic and moral values in the belief that a town's prosperity rested upon its spiritual condition. For newspaper publishers, that meant printing news and information that enhanced a settlement's chances for success, as well as publishing information that attested to the quality and the character of those who had already arrived. In addition to presenting practical information such as land prices and job opportunities, these newspapers also often published overly optimistic articles that carried varying degrees of truth about a place's future prospects. One observer remarked that, quote, "Every particular locality is the garden spot of the Union. Every little community is the most energetic and the most intelligent, every state the most patriotic, and every city a true exemplar of public virtue." By touting a place's public advantage, these publishers hoped not only to secure the interest of potential settlers and businesses, but to also drive up land prices by attracting major investments, again, such as railroads, government buildings, and also being named a county seat or, for those chosen few, a state capital. Places competed desperately against one another for railroad connections. And they often took a defensive stance against other communities that were battling for these same resources. If we are to look at a lot of these newspapers, there are disparaging comments made about nearby settlements, especially at these moments in time when similar settlements were competing for things such as railroad stops or county seats. To look at the newspaper mission statements of these newspapers on the frontier is to see very clearly articulated a vision for the newspaper and what the newspaper can do for the community. An example of a newspaper from Minnesota in 1853 said that a Northwestern Democrat must, quote, blow our trumpet if we would have our territory and our village known and the country about us settled. If we are to look at the first issue, which appears on this slide, of the Caldwell Tribune, you can see a really great example of how this mission statement was articulated. So in this first issue of the Caldwell Tribune from 1883, it says, quote, "Caldwell, by virtue of its unequaled location, with reference to the great farming, stock growing, and lumbering districts of Idaho and Eastern Oregon, is destined to be the commercial center of all the region between Salt Lake and Portland. We are here because of, and we want thousands of others to come and share with us the inevitable fruits of a good, earnest fight for the development of Idaho and the commercial, social, and political supremacy of Caldwell." These newspapers, again, included logistical details focused on settling in a community. As I mentioned, these were things like land prices, weather, job opportunities, as well as schedules for steamboats and trains. The St. Anthony Express, a newspaper in northern Minnesota, published an ad that set in 1851 that said, "We want farmers, mechanics, lawyers, ministers, physicians. Last, though not least, we also need young ladies." Additionally, these newspapers often left out certain pieces of information. They didn't report on bad weather, disease outbreaks, or news that might make a new community seem undesirable. One of the best examples of this I've seen, and this, I think my Midwestern roots are a little bit betrayed here, but in 1849, the Minnesota Pioneer described the state's brutal winters in the following way. "In fact, it is true that we have no wind, so that we actually suffer less in the coldest weather than they do in the cutting winds of Illinois at a much milder temperature. Where there is no wind, the body soon generates and carries along with it a warm atmosphere. Our cold weather is dry, bracing, and exhilarating. It gives us an appetite and it makes us fat." So to look throughout all of these newspapers is to see a very selected presentation of what life was like in these new settlements and these communities. So while I want to return in a moment to the newspapers of Idaho, we do need to take a quick divergence to the city of Chicago in the 1830s. in part because Chicago is one of the finest examples of boosterism in newspapers, but also because the explosive growth of the city of Chicago really has set a standard that many boomtowns in the West hope to capture. Chicago was a settlement, and Chicago was a city that should not have happened based on the natural characteristics of where the city developed. The name Chicago has been attributed to an abundance of bad-smelling plant life, wild garlic, leeks, and onions. The land itself was sandy, swampy, and muddy. An eyewitness account of the Chicago landscape described it as a dead-level stretch of prairie, lying by a few feet above the level of the Chicago River, most of it an undeniable swamp of the species called wet prairie. One person recalled that no one with common sense would buy land in downtown Chicago in the 1830s. But Chicago itself grew in a manner that was unprecedented and unexpected, in part due to the advertisements and the promotional rhetoric that appeared in some of its newspapers. An 1834 Chicago newspaper described the city as seeing, quote, "the floodgates of enterprise seem to be let loose upon us, and multitudes are crowding on this young land as if the pestilence were behind. People are eager to find a better home where they can build their fortunes and their hopes and enjoy the plenty which our fat fields yield to the hand of industry." Chicago was also able to secure its spot in the national imagination because its boosterism took the form of attacks on rival cities. Chicago was fixated on surpassing places such as St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati. It often battled throughout the 1870s and the 1880s with the city of Cincinnati over who best deserved the title of Porkopolis. Its battles with my hometown of Milwaukee inspired the Milwaukee Sentinel to refer to Chicago as, quote, "our gaseous neighbor at the head of the lake," and to really get quite upset at a series of Chicago editorials that appeared in the newspapers criticizing the citizens of Milwaukee. There was a notable editorial that appeared in 1856 about people who lived in Milwaukee, describing them as citizens who were to be seen drunk on every corner, which prompted a Milwaukee paper in response to protest that its residents were not intoxicated all of the time. I mentioned these articles in Chicago specifically because we do have studies that point to the importance of these news items and how these news items circulated. A review of the Chicago Democrat's circulation books revealed that 40% of the newspaper subscribers lived in competing frontier villages and beyond, stretching back to the East Coast, as well as to Europe. Newspapers were often sent back to relatives overseas, and we know from a study of other Midwestern newspapers that newspaper editors often received queries from prospective immigrants. Questions that were sent to James Madison Goodhue, the publisher of the Minnesota Pioneer, ranged from the type of building materials that were available, to the climate, to how many stores and groceries existed in his town. He answered all of these questions via letter and in the newspaper. So we know that this content, even though it was overly promotional, did have a life beyond the geographic boundaries of the settlements that produced these newspapers. So newspapers produced in Boise, newspapers produced in Murray, Idaho, likely circulated beyond those confines. Newspaper articles were clipped, they were sent to family members, they were sent to other newspapers and appeared elsewhere. So the expansion of newspapers in the Western United States coincided with the California gold rush. In 1850, there were 11 newspapers published in 11 states and territories west of the Rocky Mountains. By 1860, that number had gone up to 138, and by 1880, there were 684 newspapers published. In Idaho, there were only 6 newspapers published in 1860 and 48 newspapers published in 1880. In Washington state, almost 260 newspapers alone were started in the 1880s as Washingtonians anticipated statehood. Many of the newspapers that were published in Idaho fit this booster mold. They were meant to create an Idaho fever and promote settlement throughout the state. A 1903 history of northern Idaho described newspapers as one of the most potent factors in the development of Idaho newspaper, of northern Idaho. The newspapers themselves operated with unswerving faith and tireless zeal, laboring for the settlement and the advancement of this region, ever enthusiastic, never wearying of advertising the region's wonderful resources and possibilities. Unfortunately, our historical examination of these sources is only as good as the archives that have been preserved. And I do want to mention that there is a wonderful collection of digitized newspapers from Idaho, ranging through the mid-19th century into the early 20th century, authored through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America website. These were all digitized in conjunction with the Idaho State Historical Society. And while not complete, it's a really fantastic glimpse into what these early newspapers looked like. Included on this slide, I have a very faint copy of the first issue of the Boise News, which was the second newspaper established in the state. The first newspapers established in the state of Idaho, as some of you may know, was the Golden Age, started in Lewiston in 1862. Just to bring this to that first anecdote that I started my talk with, the publisher of the Golden Age had actually started to set out for Boise to set up a newspaper in 1864, identifying Boise as this next major point for growth in the territory of Idaho. When he had heard that those three newspaper publishers had arrived, he was already on his way to Boise and did not end up setting up another newspaper. So many of these newspapers, again, carried a lot of the same booster content that we see characteristic of many newspapers throughout the Western United States. These newspapers, though, also did things like fight with one another for circulation. In Boise, there were a lot of newspaper wars, more or less, in the growing settlement over who would have the most circulation and who would have the most number of readers. Competing newspapers also often sprung up to present different political viewpoints. In Boise, it was the Statesman versus the World. They had different national political leanings as well as different political leanings and different thoughts on local policies. Specifically, they had an intensive back and forth in 1864 over whether or not dance hall girls should be taxed in the city of Boise. The Statesman was for the tax on dance hall girls. The World was against. These newspapers also engaged in something that we can best describe as crusades. These crusades were arguments for infrastructure improvements and investment in different industries such as agriculture. Again, in Boise, the Statesman crusaded for agriculture and an expanded agricultural industry once it started to notice that mining in the area was drying up. But it's important to note that the role in the community for these newspapers went beyond just the delivery of a newspaper and the information it contained. The newspaper office also often became an important community gathering spot. In Boise, the Statesman office had become so popular that in 1868, it published rules for office loiterers. They were asked to bring their own dinners and their own tobacco. Political speeches in the office were limited to 15 minutes. The singing of John Brown's Body was limited to no more than once each half hour. The exchange papers, or the papers that newspaper received from other newspapers in the region and throughout the United States, were to stay in the office and not to be taken. And if someone was in the office and they happened to read the proofs of the next day's paper, they were not to spread that information. And they were kindly requested to not interrupt the compositor and the typesetter while they were working. Later in the 1910s and the 1920s, many newspaper offices would occupy prominent places in town, often in the central business district. Now, not all Idaho newspapers fit this booster mold, and the booster pastors themselves continued to evolve as more people moved into the region and newspapers took on a new role within the communities that they covered. Labor papers appeared in mining camps and in Boise. So labor papers such as the Gem Worker and later the Idaho Labor Herald covered issues related to labor in the state, as well as the national labor movement that was growing in the 1910s and the late teens. These newspapers also evolved as these places grew to more closely resemble their counterparts in major East Coast and West Coast cities. So I bring that up just to point out that what I've shown or discussed today really provides a glimpse into these newspapers at a specific point in time. I just wrapped up my history of mass media class today by reminding my students that it's important to look at newspapers and to look at the production of news as something that's not necessarily fixed. The production of news and the production of a newspaper really being an evolving entity that changes over time and changes to suit the needs of the environment and the communities in which they operate. So that's, I think, one of the key takeaways and one of the things that I really do enjoy about looking at these older newspapers is to not only see the differences, but also to try to understand them really as a product of a certain place and a certain point in time so that we can understand not just these papers better, but the role of newspapers and print culture more broadly as it plays in our communities. And before I turn this over to questions, I do want to make one note about the sources that I've been using in some of my projects. And that's in part because a lot of the material that we have comes from a wonderful collection of student term papers that were written at the University of Idaho from the 1930s to the 1960s that were written as part of a project to produce a manuscript of a history of Idaho newspapers. They're shelved at the University of Idaho Special Collections, and they're really wonderful, in part because many of the term papers that were written in the 1930s and the 1940s were able to include interviews and act as a sort of oral history for how some of these papers were published. So with that, I'd like to turn it over and see if you have any questions or comments. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Professor Cieslik-Miskimen, and we're delighted to have that insight into an important part of the media history of Idaho. And I know there are people in the audience today with some personal experience in editing and publishing newspapers, and would invite them to either unmute themselves and ask a question, or to just put it into the chat, and I will be glad to ask that. So let's definitely open it up for questions. And if we could, okay, we have a question already from Carolyn, is wondering where did they get the paper for printing these early newspapers?
That's a great question. So so within these, they typically would work with a supplier. So based on where a settlement was, again, those delays of paper shipments that were coming from larger paper producing regions could be really critical to whether or not a paper was produced. So there weren't that many places that produced their own paper, so they typically had to rely on outside providers. That being said, there were some major papers during this time period that did invest in having their own paper production facilities, but that was definitely not something that was common, especially in these smaller places.
So other questions from the audience? I've got a couple that I can ask while you're thinking of others. I'm wondering, when did the daily newspaper first appear in Idaho? When I know the Idaho Statesman started as tri-weekly, when did it become the Idaho Daily Statesman, and how quickly was it followed by dailies in other places in Idaho?
So typically the 1890s is going to be the first time that you see daily publications, and I can get you I don't have the specific dates right in front of me, but the publication of daily newspapers coincide with a couple of developments. So one was more robust mail service and a more robust information, sort of connection to information systems, as well as supply networks. So it's usually the 1890s, early 1900s, when we start to see more daily newspapers take hold in the state of Idaho.
And I'd like to check my memory with Butch Alford, who's in the audience. Butch, if I'm remembering correctly, didn't the Lewiston Tribune become a daily because of the Spanish-American War and the desire to provide some daily dispatches from the war zone.
You have a good memory, Kenton. The Lewiston Tribune was founded as a weekly, pretty typical, in 1892. Two young fellows, brothers that moved up from their roots in Texas. And the newspaper became a biweekly, and in 1898 became a daily. And the reason for going daily in 1898 was procuring the Associated Press wires. And the news of interest was the then militia, what would today be called the Idaho National Guard, being in the Spanish-American War. And so readers of the Lewiston Tribune could follow the boys in the War of 1898. That was the reason, the drive that meant a move to daily publication.
Well, thank you for confirming my very vague memory of that period. I think at one of maybe the Tribune Centennial, we noted that date in 1998. So a couple of other questions have appeared in the chat, and Katerina is asking, how were smaller rural newspapers influenced during wartime in the 20th century? Anything that came up that might be helpful to understand the evolution of probably not just rural newspapers, but also big city newspapers during times of war?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do just quickly want to go back. So the Idaho Statesman became a daily in 1888. So 1890s is again really where we start to see more newspapers switch to being daily publications. The question of wartime coverage is really interesting. So I can speak more to World War I, since that falls kind of within my historical area of expertise. But one of the things we see with wartime coverage is a lot of these publications weren't sending correspondents out to the fronts to cover war. They were relying very heavily on their Associated Press memberships if they had them. They might have been a member of the UPI, which was another news service. So they were covering war, but they were covering war through war correspondents that worked for these larger national wire services or worked through a newspaper syndicate. So I think one of the interesting things to look at wartime coverage within some of these smaller rural newspapers is that you might not see a lot of information about how it was directly impacting the community based on some of those content decisions publishers made, just because they weren't getting, they didn't have a staff member who was specifically covering World War I. So in some of the research I've done that's looked at World War I, wartime coverage that focuses more specifically on the community itself would be things covering, local boys who are going off to war, people who are involved in the war effort, advertisements for ways that you could contribute to the war effort through rationing, through growing your own vegetables and things like that. So a lot of the actual coverage of the war itself, though, was being provided by people who were writing for a national audience.
We have a comment from our colleague Glenn Mosley, who is observing that one of the running themes in John Ford's movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, was on the importance of the newspaper to the Western town in that film. And he notes the picture's famous line, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Any observations about sort of this relationship between the development of a town and the way it became civilized and the role of the newspaper in making that place more urban, more part of the establishment and less part of the frontier?
Yeah, I think it's worth It's worth reminding ourselves, and I often have to do this because I'm partial to newspapers, I'm partial to print, that's what I study. But these are only one of a series of factors that's going to determine whether or not a town or a settlement either achieves the goals of its boosters or if it falls short. So the newspapers could only do so much. And there's countless examples where that promotional rhetoric was not reflected in the reality of what happened to these places. For mining towns in Idaho, once a mine dried up, if there was no investment in another industry, then that was kind of it, and things moved on. It's not just mining towns in Idaho. I mean, if you look at some of the towns that sprung up along the rail lines in Montana through the Dakotas into Minnesota and Wisconsin, a lot of these towns saw an initial flurry of activity. But if there wasn't any sort of other sustaining investment, they would typically fade within a matter of decades. So the newspaper could do a lot in trying to send a signal of civilization or a signal of advancement. But the newspaper itself couldn't make up for unsustainable economic conditions or some of the realities of just modernization. A lot of these towns, as they are growing in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is a point in time where the United States is becoming much more interconnected. So all of these tools that are allowing these towns to grow and to make themselves appear as being cosmopolitan and not being these frontier settlements are also some of those tools of interconnectedness that limit their ability to grow on the same pace as like a Chicago did. And there are a number of places throughout the Western United States that tried to sell themselves as the new Chicago or the next Chicago, and they never got remotely close to achieving Chicago's success, both as an economic and transportation hub, but also in terms of population.
We have a couple of questions that ask about just the size of these newspapers. What was a typical circulation? How many copies a week for a paper on the frontier, a mining town or a railroad town in Idaho or the inland west?
Typically a few hundred. There are a few places in the 1890s, around 1900, where their circulation will creep into the 5,000, 7,000 or so. But most of these were very small operations. And a lot of these printers used newspapers in a sense to advertise the fact that they had access to a printing press and they could print other materials. So they were trying to make money off of their newspapers, but they did not try to make money off of their newspapers alone. They would print posters, they would print annual reports, they would often try to get contracts with local governments to print government materials to supplement their income.
And then this may be beyond the scope of your research, but Don is wondering, what was the high water mark in terms of the number of newspapers published in Idaho, and how many of them, how many papers are still being published today? And we may want to turn to Butch for a response on how many are published today, but Caitlin, anything that you know?
I guess the numbers I have in front of me only go up to 1890, and I have 48 newspapers. So 48 newspapers in 1880 and 1890 in the state.
So Butch, I think there are, 10 or 11 dailies in Idaho. Are there still 30 or 35 weeklies? Is that a good ballpark?
That's a good ballpark number. I'm not sure of the exact number. It's right around 38, 40, I believe, KB.
Okay, yeah. Katerina is wondering, when did paper boys begin, or probably carriers is the term we would use today as a general delivery method, as opposed to coming to the newspaper office to pick up the paper each week, or having them sent through the mail. Any idea on that?
So if we're talking specifically about Western papers, most of these newspapers were distributed through the mail through the 19th century. Paper boys, or if you also wanted to include like newsboys in that category, were really a product of those denser urban areas. So they were things that developed typically in East Coast media centers like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and those areas. So I'm not sure what year roughly what year they would have appeared in Idaho, but at least through the turn of the 20th century, it was the mail that was primarily distributing a lot of these newspapers, or people would go to the physical office to pick up a newspaper or buy a copy of the newspaper there. And in part because if we think about a lot of these places too, they were either very small and concentrated or very large and spread out, which just made that distribution system a bit unsustainable initially. But I'm not sure at what point that delivery method took hold in Idaho.
So Don Burnett observes that after the Civil War, Idaho received substantial migration from residents of the former Confederacy, bringing with them views on race and the role of states versus national government, which continue to influence Idaho politics. He wonders, did any early Idaho newspapers explicitly seek to appeal to those Confederate audiences and interests? Anything that you picked up from sort of 1860s through 1880s?
Not that I've seen yet, but that's a really great observation and a great comment for things to look for. I think that if we're looking at divisions leading up to during the Civil War, there was most of what I've seen has largely been pro-union, or divisions between newspapers over the Mormon faith, and what to do or how to welcome or not welcome Mormon people practicing the Mormon faith that were moving into southern Idaho. That's been, I think, one of the bigger points of divisions that I've seen so far.
We've got about 5 minutes to go, and I have a couple questions that ask you to speculate a little bit about the future of newspapers. And I know historians are sometimes reluctant to predict what might happen based on what has happened in the past. So let me pose both of them together. One is from Brian, wondering whether you see newspaper roles changing in the future as they have gotten smaller in both size of the publication and in the print circulation. And then also Don wonders about changes in technology over the decades and what that can teach us about the transition that print newspapers are in now, online editions, daily newsletters, and use of social media. So that's a big topic that certainly goes beyond the limits of your research, but if you wanted to just weigh in with an opinion about what we might expect in years to come.
Yeah, I think first I would say that any of the individuals on this call that have experience in newsrooms are probably a bit more qualified to comment on some of the recent changes. But I can talk about a point in time in the early 1900s when community newspaper publishers and publishers of newspapers in smaller towns were feeling a lot of competitive pressure from city newspapers that were expanding into these small towns and kind of encroaching on their territory, so to say. And one of those newspaper publishers, William Allen White of the Emporia, Kansas Gazette, wrote quite a bit about what it meant to be a country printer and to be a country editor. And part of his arguments were that nothing can replace the community building function of a newspaper. And a large newspaper or a chain can come into a town and it can bring in all of these great articles written by writers who live in New York or live in Chicago or live in any of these other urban areas. But these writers are never going to be able to understand kind of the nuances of small town life. So he really saw his newspaper as having a very important community role, and a role is preserving that sense of community, even as it faced more competition from these other cultural centers. So I guess I tend to think of newspapers in that regard. And personally, my areas of interest from a research perspective are on that cultural community building function of print media broadly, but also newspapers specifically. And I do think in a lot of the conversations that we're having currently about local media and the local media landscape, there tends to be an overemphasis on that democratic function of the press, that the function of the press as it relates to an educated electorate. And that is very important. But we also can't neglect that cultural role that a newspaper plays in a community. What does it mean when a newspaper publishes the names of all of the high school graduates from that city, that small city or that town? What does it mean when the newspaper sponsors events? What does it mean when the newspaper's office is centrally located and does become a community institution of sorts? So I would just encourage people, when we talk about the current state of local newspapers, yes, we should think about the information that's included, and yes, we should think about all of these other very important reporting functions that these newspapers do, but we also need to consider some of that, again, that cultural role that these papers play, because they do really help create a community's fabric. And as they decline, or as they might cut back in their publication schedule, there are some very real threats to that cultural role that they can occupy within a specific place. So I guess that was one question. Technology. I mean, I became a historian to not have to deal with technology issues. But I think, you know, looking at all of these other tools, it's worth considering what some newspapers did in the 1930s and 1940s with radio and other platforms. And not all newspapers were able to do this, but many newspapers in a little bit larger communities saw radio stations and saw some of these other media platforms as ways to expand their reach and ways to cultivate goodwill. So there's actually an excellent book by the historian Michael Stamm on newspaper ownership of radio stations and how newspapers can look to some of these other technology platforms as ways to expand their reach, but also from a less idealistic standpoint, kind of ingratiate themselves into a community by providing another type of service.
Seeing no other questions in chat or no hands raised, I think we've come to the end of our hour, and thank you for this informative, interesting, and inspiring in some ways presentation. And it's a great way to wrap up the semester. And again, if you have questions about this topic or would like to offer information for continued research, please contact our speaker. And Caitlin, perhaps you can put your slide back at the end so that people can see that. But before you do that, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to turn on your camera and give a virtual round of applause to our speaker today, or to put a hand up through the chat function in Zoom. It's wonderful to have so many of you with us today, and especially for our journalism and mass media majors, a chance to learn more about what we're doing here in terms of research that helps keep our teaching fresh and lively, and may have some benefit to current practice of mass media. So our next presentation will be on Tuesday, the 19th of January in 2021. And the topic is still to be determined. I'm still working on the schedule for the spring, but I hope that you will be able to join us then. If you have friends who missed today's presentation, this was recorded, and it will be available on the Renfrew Colloquium YouTube channel later today. So feel free to share that information with others. So again, thanks to everyone for your attendance and participation this semester. Have a great finals week and winter break. Stay warm, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Kenton.
Bye for now.